We should probably get started. You all look so rested and relaxed from your week down in Florida, on the beaches, right? Well, we're really pleased to have Michael Roloff with us here today from Northwestern University. Mike did his PhD work at Michigan State. How many years ago?
No, we don't talk.
You've been at Northwestern for 31 years.
I finished my PhD in 1975.
You were just coming, just as I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. His work focuses primarily on the area of interpersonal influence. And he's published a book entitled Interpersonal Communication, the Social Exchange Approach. But when you say interpersonal influence, it's not like this is a narrow little field he's working in here. Because he's published and edited books in the areas of persuasion, social cognition, negotiation, and interpersonal processes. It covers a pretty wide swath of things, I'd say. He's also co-editor and has been co-editor of Communication Research, which used to be here at the Annenberg School. And Sandra Balber-Keach was co-editor of it, and I was editor before her. Mike has also been a recipient of the Woolbert Award for outstanding contributions to communication research from the National Communication Association. And he's won several teaching awards. And something I learned last night that I didn't know was that he's also chair of the Northwestern University Institutional Review Board in the social sciences. No, this was very helpful. I learned a lot. It was really, really very much fun to have you here and get a chance to meet with you and have you meet with our students and faculty. And now we're looking forward to hear your talk.
Well, thank you. I mean, being the head of the IRB, geez, you know, on campus, I rarely tell anyone that. You know, and typically it allows me to enter into friendly conversations where one of my colleagues will say, do you know what that damn IRB did? And I'll go, yeah, let's go get them, right? You know, and I never had to worry that they were going to figure out it was me. So this is between all of us, and we intend to edit that out of the tape that's being done right now, so no one at Northwestern will know who the director of the Social and Behavioral Science panel of the IRB might be. I wanted to thank Peter for inviting me. I ran into him at NCA and he invited me, and I was very, very honored. Having been at Northwestern as long as I have, one of the sad facts of being at a place for so long is you start becoming a lot like the furniture. You know, which means that I'm kind of purple and white in some ways, and people sit on me a lot. Sometimes they step over me as well as they're going on to do other things. And it's so odd to talk to a group of people who actually seem interested. You know, so, you know, you're boosting my ego being here, although I'm beginning to wonder whether you're just here for the food or not. But anyway, here I am, and, you know, I'm going to talk about some of my research. Now, in terms of this presentation, I always like to start by letting you know how I got here, not just what the studies are like. Gives you sort of a context for the way I tried to think about this. And you always have to worry about an old buffalo like me describing that context, because it's always going to sound more planned than it really was. It also may well sound like I was the only one doing it when there were a raft of people who were helping me do it. And I'll try to remember their names and acknowledge them as I go along. But, you know, I get caught up in the moment, and narcissism has always been my strong suit. And so I'll try to talk a little bit about the collaborative things that we've done. You know, as Peter pointed out, I'm primarily interested in interpersonal influence and trying to explain to you why. When I was, well, about 5 years after I was at Northwestern, back when Tom Goodnight was a colleague of mine, we hired a faculty member named Robin Lester. And Robin had a lot of talents: pinball, pool, gambling, drinking, any number of different things. And one of the insights she also had was human nature. And so one time we were sitting around talking, and I said, you know, I'm teaching this graduate seminar, new doctoral students, about how to pick your research. And she said, well, you know, I've got a theory about that. And I said, a theory about how academics choose research? And she says, yeah. She says, it's called the academic disability hypothesis. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, well, I've watched all these academicians, and it seems to me they study what they're not good at. And they're trying desperately to become better. It's really a narcissistic self-insight process that most of us are involved with, which tells you something about how influential I am in my life. Because I'm continuing to study this after this long period of time. I mean, when I got into this business, I graduated, in 1968. The society was in turmoil. I was a student activist trying to persuade people to change and was by and large unsuccessful, and applied to graduate school at Michigan State where they were studying persuasion. So I showed up there ready to learn all the new techniques, only to discover the people who were studying it decided it was a dead area and were no longer doing that. So I became a little bit disgruntled since it was apparent I wasn't going to get my skill set while I was in graduate school there. So I was trying to figure out what to do next. And so I got married. Well, and then I discovered that really persuasion had no reality for me anymore, that my wife was unconvincible. And so as a result, I became interested in conflict resolution. So I spent some time trying to study how you resolve conflict, and that worked reasonably well for a while. And then my wife and I had children. And then I suddenly shifted my interest to compliance gaining. And you see, for me, it was no longer about persuading someone to change or resolving the disputes. It was called, make these little beggars do what I tell them to do. You know, I don't care if they like it as long as they do it. Everything's working out okay. So I was going along well with my career. I filled some of my skill sets. And all of a sudden, my colleagues came to me and said, Roloff, it's your turn to be chair of the department. And I immediately went, oh, no. And they said, yeah, you need to do this. So for 3 dark years of my life, I chaired the department. And all of a sudden, I became interested in negotiation and integrated bargaining. And how can I take all these disparate interests that are so well entrenched in the faculty and try to get these people to work together? And that lasted a little bit. And all of a sudden, I became heavily interested in burnout. So I published several studies on worker burnout as I was experiencing it, going through the administrative process and deciding every night I was emotionally numb. You know, I came home and my wife would say, the children burned the house down, and I go, yeah. We won the lottery, yeah. You're going to school, yeah, I don't care. These people are just objects to me and it's not doing me any good. Anyway, so I got out of being chair just in time. And I went back to studying conflict. And this time I knew to study it better than I did the first time, so I went from studying conflict resolution to conflict management. Now, for the uninitiated, they hear that and say, aren't they the same? No, there was a time we believed in conflict resolution. Now we believe in management. Management is a decidedly different concept than resolution. Resolution means it's over. Management means we are handling it, right? You know, it's not gone away. So I started expanding my research area to reflect the fact that I was interested in conflict management, and I had learned from roughly 20 years of marriage and raising 3 children. There were a whole lot of things that were not sufficiently appreciated about conflict that I was going to start studying. So I started looking at conflict avoidance. Now, usually when I talked about conflict avoidance to a group of communication people, they would begin to hiss and boo. Bad, bad, bad. And if you read through people who are conflict avoiders, you get this really pathetic impression of them. They're passive, they aren't articulate, they're heavily introverted. And I thought they were just plain smart. Right? That these people had figured out that this wasn't resolvable and they were doing everything in their skill set to avoid the damn conflict. So we started doing research on the campus. We initially started with people who were dating, and we found the 2 on the Northwestern campus who were dating. And so we brought them together. I mean, I'd come to a group like this, and I'd say, all right, I'm doing a study on dating. How many of you are dating? I'd have 100 students, 1 hand. I'd sit there and go, this isn't going to work. It isn't going to work. I mean, some of you must be doing something in your free time, right? And somebody would say, well, what do you mean by dating? And I'd say, well, have you gone out 3 times? And I'd get 4 more hands. And I'd say, okay, have you ever looked across the room and had eye contact with somebody and imagined that you were dating with them? And I still only got 50 hands. But anyway, I managed through trick and everything to manage to get enough people to do this. And so we had a very simple test of conflict avoidance. We gave them a questionnaire, and at the top of it we said, all right, we want you to list everything you find annoying or irritating about the person you're involved with. Well, it was Northwestern, so they filled the first 10 lines, turned it over, and wrote 10 more lines on the back side of it, which perhaps tells you why only 2 or 3 people are dating. So they go through that list, and we said, all right, we want you to circle everyone that you've told your partner about. We tricked them, right? So they list all the irritations. Then we asked them, have you told them? And we found roughly half of the things people found really irritating about their partners, they were withholding. So then we said, why? Now that's when I got a new insight as a social scientist. I was trained in the bad old days where everyone sort of said, there's one theory that accounts for everything. And when we started looking through all of the reasons why people were withholding complaints, we discovered it was multifunctional. There wasn't one theory that really drove all this. There were a bunch of them. So one we looked at was dependency. It turns out if you happen to be one of those poor individuals who thinks that you're dating Mr. or Ms. Perfect, and you, on the other hand, are incredibly flawed, meaning nobody wants anything to do with you, but you are dating the one person everyone in the world wants, you don't say a lot when you're about those irritations, right? Because this person might just leave you, and then you've got no one that could come close. Then we looked at others, and asked them, why didn't you tell them about this? And they said, because they'd yell. They'd get real ticked off. So we did another study where we were looking at what they thought the anticipated reaction of the other person would be. We called it coercive potential, the likelihood you were going to be verbally abused if you told them this. And we found a lot of people were withholding complaints because they feared the verbal abuse that was going to come from their partner. And you know what was really sad? The primary complaint they were withholding is their partner was too dominant. The very thing that was driving you crazy, you could not mention to that other individual. Talk about being trapped in a cage, right? You know, something is just annoying you and you can't address the thing because to do it would cause the annoyance to escalate. Then we found these others we particularly liked. They said, you know, I'm not telling them about all these annoyances because our relationship isn't intimate enough. That's when we discovered there's a threshold for complaining. Right? That in the initial stages, when your relationship is escalating, you're counting annoyances, right? You're accumulating them. You know, this person's got a lot of problems, and I can't tell them yet, but once I get them trapped, then I'm going to tell them about everything. You know, they sometimes, you know, actually there is documentation that some men have a commitment phobia. They have a hard time committing. Do you know why? What happens the day they commit to the woman? Well, there's this list of things, of imperfections that she's seen in him for all of this time that she now feels free to describe in great detail to him. So you get all of this really nifty stuff. Now, we also found that some people don't confront because they lack self-efficacy. They just can't imagine how they could confront another individual. And it's not because they don't think a confrontation will work. They just don't think they can enact one. And so for them, you have to establish mastery, a la Bandura, and all of the stuff that's associated with that. So I studied conflict avoidance for quite a while. A lot of it aimed, as I said, at trying to understand why people do it. And we even found some research that ran contrary to what other people thought, that if you do it, it actually makes for a more peaceful and satisfying relationship, which worked well with John Gottman's research because he finds one of the 3 very happy, stable types of marriages are avoiders. And he even notes in his book on what predicts divorce that therapists don't know how to train conflict avoidance. They know how to train people to do empathic listening and confrontation and emotional expression. But if you tell them, pick your fights well, what? You know, does that mean I have to be quiet sometimes? How do I do that? And so there wasn't a great deal of respect for conflict avoidance, and I've tried to establish a little bit. Now, that was one thing I did for a while, and suddenly I became interested in what real arguments look like. You know, one of the things that drives me crazy about Gottman and others who study sort of conflict in the lab is they advertise. They bring in couples, they pay them $20 to have a fight in front of a TV camera. Apparently that's not a problem, right? You just advertise to the community, $20, have a fight, we're going to record it. And people show up in droves. So they stand there, they fight it out, and they look it over, and then they analyze what goes on. And they get to the end, they say, here's what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And they act like the damn thing's resolved. It's over with. That ain't my life. That ain't my life. I've had fights that have been going on my entire marriage. Some of them have been going on since we started dating. Right? They're called in-laws. You know what? They stay even after they die. I mean, that ain't right. It ain't right. You know, they're not there anymore. And you're fighting over the memory of the in-laws? Whoa! So I became interested in what's called serial arguing. Serial arguing, in Gottman's term, really has to do with these intractable disputes, irresolvable disputes people can't possibly handle. In the negotiation, Coleman's research on intractable conflict is an example of all this stuff. Serial arguing is where you've been having the same argument for an extended period of time, right? You get into an initial episode. Something sets you off. You get to the end of the episode. Sometimes you think it's resolved. Oh, woe be unto you. We've interviewed a few people. We said, did you think it was over with at the end of the first episode? And they go, yeah. And I said, what happened? It came back. Why did it come back? I don't know. But it came back. And now it won't leave. It's like an uninvited, unfriendly relative who has come to your home and says, we're blood, I get to stay. And it just stays for an extended period of time. So we started interviewing people about the kinds of conflicts they have that are serial, that just won't go away. And we were primarily interested in that point on the impact they'd have on relational quality. In other words, it seemed to me that it was, well, actually it was fun. Kristen Johnson, one of the graduate students I worked with, came in. Unlike me, who's sort of this cynical, down individual, Kristen's this up and excited person. And so we sat down and we were interested in studying serial arguing, and I said, boy, you know, this must just destroy relationships. And Kristen would look at me and go, no, it doesn't. I said, how can that be? They're fighting all the time over the same issue. They don't seem to be making any progress. And she looked at me and said, they're working it out. You don't understand, Mike. They're working it out. So I said, well, this is an empirical question. So we need to go out and find out if they're working it out and whether it makes any difference or not. So we did our first study where we went out and we looked at people and asked them how many serial arguments they had, and we got reports of them. And she was right and I was right. One of the best predictors of whether your serial arguing was creating problems in your relationship or not is whether you perceived you were making progress towards resolving it or not. If it seemed resolvable, then you were doing okay. But if you didn't think it was resolvable, then this thing began to grate. Now, we talk about these things a lot. You know, I always am a little fearful when I mention this kind of an effect, but we found a gender effect, and it turns out men and women have different viewpoints of whether it's resolvable. All right? And this is consistent with some other research, so don't just blame me. Some of what our research and other stuff said is women are a lot more optimistic it's resolvable than your basic male is. So she's sitting there and she's going, we're making progress. We're working it out. And he's sitting there going, I'm dying. I'm dying. We ain't going nowhere. And so we started talking to those who said they weren't making progress, and they started describing their serial arguments about repeating the same thing over and over again. It had become scripted. In Kristen's dissertation, we brought in couples who had serial arguments and put them in separate rooms and had them write out a sample of what was usually said. It was great. It was like reading a script of a play, because they would sit down and they go, she says, he says, she says, he says, and we started matching the scripts, and they matched. You know, usually we talk about this, well, they're making mistakes. They're just fabricating. It's not really scripted. And you're reading down through this thing, and there apparently are some conflicts that don't get any better. And they're trapped in a rut. They are just spinning their wheels as they go over this thing over and over and over. Now, not only does the discourse become scripted, but we ask them, can you tell what's going to set these things off? Are there certain conditions you know that's going to set this thing off? And we started getting people reporting back going, oh yeah, there are a lot of things that'll set this thing off. Let me describe them for you. And so sometimes they're external events, sometimes they're mood states they see their partner in, but they can tell something's going to happen. A colleague of mine at the University of Georgia brought in married couples, and he was interviewing them about their serial arguments. Not surprisingly, certain topics emerge, a lot more than you get in dating, but there are certain topics in marriage that show up. In-laws, as I said, is one of them that appears to be a serial argument people have a hard time resolving. But people don't talk about in-laws all the time. There are special events at which in-law relationships activate their serial arguing. holidays, right? Where are we going to spend the time? Who are we going to call? You know, what are we going to buy them? Do we buy as much for yours as mine? Woo! You know, and so you've got all of these various and sundry types of issues that come with the holidays that create serial arguing over in-laws. Money doesn't always create a problem. You go through times, you know, there's a study that just came out in Family Processes looking at topics of marital conflict. Money is up there, but it doesn't show up all the time. It takes special circumstances for it to occur. So again, it gets a little holiday driven because at the holidays you have to buy stuff. As I explained, my wife and I have 3 children. They all have college degrees now. I went through 11 straight years of college tuition plus 1 year of 2. 1 year, we had a serial argument that lasted 365 days. Okay? As we went back and forth over everything that was related to money. So you began to figure out when you looked at the serial arguing that these things do become attached to the relationship. They aren't always resolvable. Some of them go on for a long time. And one of the ways I thought they might end are that people would learn to manage them. Because given we had an idea of what might generate them and the kinds of problems that emerge from them, the real issue becomes how do you cope with them? And one of the things that we found coming out of the literature is that one thing that seemed to work well with coping with your serial argument, your relationship, was a strategy called optimistic comparisons. And that actually was a strategy or coping strategy that was originally studied with children. You know, it's awful. You know, when I cover in my conflict class stuff dealing with kids, I used to talk about the best way to raise them. Now I talk about the best way to cope with them. And one of them is optimistic comparisons, where you keep saying to yourself, they're getting better, right? They're not as bad as they were. And you look at other children and say, at least my kid's not as bad as that one, right? You know, these are the parents who get up every week and check the police blotter, and they're actually a little bit pleased when they recognize somebody else's kid's name in the police blotter and it wasn't theirs, you know, and they can sort of go, ah! Well, one of the things that we found is that people tended to feel better about their serial arguing if they could do optimistic comparisons. If they could sit down and say, we are making progress, you know. We used to fight a lot about this. We're not fighting as much. We're moving towards where we want to be. And you know what? We don't fight as viciously as other people. And often their reference group are their parents, right? That's where your parents who may have had a conflictual marriage help you a lot. Because you can sit back and say, gee, ours is bad, but it's not nearly as bad as theirs was. So as long as you can keep spinning this thing in a positive way, you're okay. Where you get in trouble is when you start engaging in resignation. We're doomed. We'll never agree on this issue. Now, I added another element to that. Some of you know years ago, Leslie Baxter did a study on what she called taboo topics, where people declared topics off the table for discussion, where you just look at that other person and say, we're never, ever going to talk about this again. So we looked at people who had serial arguing to see if they were able to control it and end it ultimately by declaring the topic completely off the table. Now, in the study, we found it depended on how they did it. If they both kind of reached a silent accord, you know, we talk about implicit negotiation instead of back and forth, more of an implicit understanding. If they implicitly negotiated the topic off the table for any future discussion, they were in reasonably good shape. If they explicitly negotiated it off the table, it failed. And of course, one of the problems with that is when you reach an explicit accord, you have to remember the accord, which means you're remembering the thing you're not supposed to talk about, which in essence keeps it in mind and keeps the serial arguing going. Because one of the other things we discovered that does keep a serial arguing going, we did a study where we were interested in what we called mulling. And mulling means you get into a fight with somebody, the episode is over with, but it ain't over with. You're going to think about it, and you're going to walk out of there, and you're going to think about, you know what she said to me? She said this. And then you're sitting there, you know what I should have said in return? This is what I should have said. You know, And when we were looking at people who were mulling, we let them do sort of a think aloud about their last conflict. This is before IRB. But we let them talk about a recent conflict they had and what they were thinking about. It got worse the longer they were thinking. You know, initially it was sort of, well, we had a disagreement. You know what that son of a bitch said? You know, it's filled with obscenity. and they're beginning to talk about, I'm going to get that person, and they start plotting for the next interaction. I mean, some of you may have experienced that in real life. You think the episode is over with. They go off and start mulling, and suddenly they come looking for you. And you're walking down the hall, and all of a sudden this person walks up, I thought that was over with. No, it isn't. It isn't over with till I say it's over with. Right? I get to call this to a close, not you. And then the damn thing is back again. Well, at about the time I was looking at serial arguing and getting pretty depressed, I started teaching over at the Family Institute, where I started working with couples counselors on people who had real problems, not the kind I'd been studying. And as we started looking at serial arguing, which does take place in couples going through counseling, some of theirs are very, very serious, I started getting depressed about how much we can save relationships. I don't want to say that too loudly because I don't want all the students to drop out of that program. But it becomes very difficult. In fact, oftentimes I stand up in front of people and say it's much easier to make a wise choice on your relationship up front than it is to repair it. Repairing it appears to be very difficult. And so I became depressed again. And I started thinking, wow, things aren't working out so well. I've lost my last skill set. All I'm doing is showing that there is no hope. So I started hearing my father in my head. My father had said, son, you're getting older. I was getting ready to turn 50. And I said, Dad, how's that work, physically? And he says, I'm sorry to say this to you, son, but the rot sets in at 50. So I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, rot doesn't sound good. I mean, there are a lot of things you could talk about at 50. Rot is not one of the things that seems to me to sound very good. And being sort of your typical male, I hadn't seen a doctor since they were going to put me in Vietnam. I mean, it had been a long time since I had been to a doctor. So I had to find one. And so I go in to see the doctor, and the doctor starts going down a checklist of things that are wrong with me. Longer than my wife's, actually. It was kind of amazing. She has, I thought, a complete list, but he found a whole bunch of other things. And so we're sitting there, and he says, your cholesterol's too high, your blood pressure's too high. And he says, we're going to have to make some changes here. And I'm like, this does not sound good. This is the worst thing I'd kind of anticipated. And he says, do you drink alcohol? Yeah. And I said, I really like beer. It's good. I'm not a drunk, but I like beer. Well, we're going to have to get rid of that. Oh. And he says, you drink coffee? Coffee, my God. Yes. And he says, that's not good. That's not good. And I'm sitting there going, I'm going to die now. I'm just going to die now. And then he looks at me and he says, let's talk about your lifestyle. Are you under any stress? I said, okay. I'm married. I got 3 kids. I teach at Northwestern. I'm on the IRB. I co-edit a journal. I've got a legion of people who are angry with me at any given moment. I mean, yes, there are worse stressors than this. I am employed at a prestigious university, but I tell you, yeah, I got stress. Why do you think I drink? It's self-medication. Why in God's name do you think I'm doing this? And he says, well, we got to do something or you're going to die. And I said, well, got any medication? I'm from the 60s, better living through chemistry. I'm sort of, I can take drugs every day, just bring them on, And so I got my Lipitor, I got all those things I take every evening. But he says, you really need to do something. Well, that's when I had another paradigm shift. Remember, I always do things that I don't do well. So I became interested in taking conflict and looking at it in stress. I know that was a long way to finally get to the topic, but I became interested in not saving relationships, but saving yourself. All right? That maybe we can't save a relationship, but maybe we can increase our time on this planet. And I was interested in the effect of arguing and conflict on your physical health, which up to that point I had not read anything about. So in my usual diligent way, I went online and Googled and all the rest of that and started finding a literature on this and found some really intriguing stuff on diaries that are kept on events during the day and your stress levels during the day. And they had distinguished between sort of ordinary stressors and chronic stressors in what happens to you. So one of them is sort of out of the ordinary I had last week. You got to bear with my narcissism again. Chicago is filled with potholes. Last night, Peter asked me if I meant potheads, but no, not potheads. We have potholes. During the winter in Chicago, the cars chew up the roads in massive amounts. We get craters. You cannot miss them, quite frankly. And so last week on the way home, I was turning right where I always turn right. A pothole had emerged. I hit it square on. It blew the tire. Boom! And I swerved over to the side of the road. It was a relatively new car, which meant I didn't know where the jack was. So I had to pull out. It seems like every time I get a new car, they move the jack. And they secure it differently than they did before. And they're playing hide and seek with the spare tires. So I'm reading through this thing, trying to figure out where the damn thing is and how you put it together. And 20 minutes later, I got the tire on. And I could feel it. The stress was there as I kicked the side of the car and cursed loudly and slammed doors and all that good shit. And then the next day spent hours trying to find a replacement tire because it turns out that tire's not common in Chicago. So, you know, life gets ugly, but I got over it. And you know what? The research indicates that those kinds of stressors people adapt to because it was over with in 2 days. It really was. I had the serious event. I took care of it. And then the next day I managed to find the tire. I took care of it. And da-da! It's over with. And my stress level began to go down. And I could feel it going down. What they also discovered with chronic stressors, one great example of that is everyday arguing. And they discovered that people do not adapt stress-wise to their arguments. When the argument emerges, stress levels go up, and it takes 2 or 3 days before they see any reduction in the stress level. Now, they were trying to figure out why that happens. One of it could be serial arguing. You get into a fight with your spouse, the episode ends, you see him a couple hours later, wham, you let him have it again, then you go disengage, and it becomes part of your life for the next 3 days. And your stress level just stays really high. You know, as you're walking along, I'm really pissed off. Then I found this interesting stuff done by a psychologist at Ohio State. I believe her name's Keelcold Glaser, who does research on stress hormones, cortisol. And so what she did is she had people argue with each other while they monitored the cortisol in their blood and discovered that when you argue with your spouse, your cortisol levels go up and they stay reasonably high. And she did a study where she had people who were cut. You know, I don't know what IRB was doing. But anyway, they cut them and they looked at, after they had an argument, how long it took for the wound to heal. And they discovered that if you have a wound and you've gotten in an argument with your spouse, it takes longer for the wound to heal than if you weren't in an argument with your spouse. So you now have a link to something that appears to be physiological and your immune system functioning. And an argument is a sufficient stressor that it slows down the efficiency of your immune system in sort of taking care of your well-being. Which means if you're involved in a highly argumentative relationship, you could be prone to stress-related health symptoms. Things as simple as not being able to sleep, things that are associated with loss of appetite, or could be associated with eating more than what you should be eating, excessive drinking. There's a whole bunch of things we found that are heavily correlated with stress. So we went about trying to study this. Now again, I'm the head of the IRB, so the IRB gets really nasty when you do a study saying you're going to make people sick. There's this ethical concern that bothers us. You know, you can almost say we're going to let you wreck a marriage as long as you're a counseling psychologist who can repair it afterwards. But when you say I'm going to make someone sick, what are you going to do to undo that, right? Anybody can do research that's bad as long as you undo the harm. And I don't know how you undo the harm. So we can't really make people sick. We can't create variation. I'm a variable analytic kind of guy. So I need variables out there, and I can't create variation, so I have to capitalize on variation, which means I have to rely on self-reports, diaries, questionnaires, and things like that about the episodes that people have, and I have to live with all the weaknesses that come with those methods. So the first study we were interested in was a pathological interaction pattern called demand-withdrawal. We know that demand-withdrawal is something that also shows up in serial arguing. Demand-withdrawal is a typical pattern where one person comes in and says, you must change, and the other person stonewalls. Stonewalling can take a variety of reactions. Some people grow silent. Elvis has left the building, so to speak, so you're sitting there screaming at the person, right? You know, no reaction at all. Sometimes, Gottman talks about this, males in particular are guilty of this. I had to untrain myself of doing this after I got married because I had my head taken, used to be several feet taller. My wife took off the height. But anyway, I was talking to her and we'd get into a serial argument, we'd start moving into the scripted one, and men engage in what's called the appeal to God gesture. Oh man, you want to piss a woman off? That'll do it. She would look at me and she'd say, don't be appealing to God. She ain't going to help you. You know, and it was just horrible. Now, we know that if there is a pattern within the marriage where there's a lot of demand withdrawal, that's correlated with it's negatively correlated with marital satisfaction. You can have a little of that in any marriage, but if you get to an excessive point, we've got real difficulties there. A lot of different theories about why demand withdrawal occurs. One of them says it's gendered. Basically, females or wives have a much worse reality than husbands do, so they're always demanding their husbands are changing, and their husbands are benefiting from this injustice, so they stonewall as a way of keeping things the same. Some people argue, like Gottman, that it's a difference in stress hormones, that men find arguing more stressful than women do, so women emotionally flood men. So they come in, they start yelling at them, the man's arousal level goes up, his reaction to arousal is to fight or flee, and he doesn't want to hit her, so what he does is shut down, and he quits talking as a way of keeping himself under control during the course of this argument. And then there's another theory, which I think works reasonably well. It's not gendered at all. One of the reasons we found that oftentimes it was the wife who was initiating a lot of the demands in this stuff. In fact, Gottman's research says wives often engage in what's called harsh initial startup. That's where I come home and my wife says, and you left your socks on the floor, you know, as I come walking in the door, right? And that sort of floods people when it happens. And this one says, no, 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 it's not really gendered. What happens is the person who is the change agent, who wants this person to change, is the one who comes in demanding, and the person who is being told to change becomes very passive. And when they looked at research that was done on couples, they have to have them argue about something. So the typical way is you bring the husband and wife in and they say, I want you to reenact an argument. Who wants to pick a topic? Wife raises her hand. I got one. And they say, okay, what do you want to talk about? You know what he does. Okay, and he says, all right, that's the one we're going to reenact. So they run a different study. This time they randomly assign who gets to pick. When you look at the husband and say, okay, what's your topic? Do you know what she does? And he's just like she is, and they suddenly discovered that when the man gets to choose the topic, he becomes very demanding, and she suddenly starts withdrawing. Now, there is a gender difference that shows up. When a woman comes in and she's demanding and the man withdraws, he's out of the conversation for the rest of the conversation. With a wife, when the man comes in and he demands, she withdraws, she's thinking. What do you think she's thinking about? What he's done wrong. And suddenly we get another demand withdrawal loop with a different initiator that extends the conversation. But still, demand withdrawal is a bad thing. So when we started looking at serial arguing, we thought what we would find is the person who initiates the conflict and demands it, basically, because when we go to serial arguing, we find there's usually one person who initiates the change attempt. That person will become increasingly frustrated to the extent their partner withdraws, right? In essence, if I'm coming in and I'm asking my wife to change and she stonewalls me, that's going to make me angrier. On the other hand, when you are the target, you're the person who's being told to change, withdraw is a functional thing in terms of your stress level, because what you do is quit listening to what the other person says, which allows your stress to go down, and you have less stress after the conversation. That's exactly what we found. That the person who came in to initiate when their partner withdrew had higher stress levels at the end of the thing, and when they were the target, if they withdrew, they had lower stress levels, and that even showed up well after the episode was over with. So for some people, it seemed to be fairly functional to be able to withdraw from the interaction. Not functional for the relationship, but functional for their stress, right? That's where you always have to make a distinction. I'm not saying it's good for your relationship. I'm saying it's good for the stress level that you're feeling, because these people have stopped listening. As I used to tell my daughters, it's hard to have a one-person argument. And when one person says, I'm not going to be responding, usually the other person gives up. They quit arguing and the thing goes away. So then we did another study where we wanted to find out how you could cope with being in a serial argument. Back to that coping stuff we talked about earlier. This time we got a different response. Optimistic comparisons did not help reduce your stress. I thought they would have, that if you thought you were getting along better, you wouldn't feel as much stress after the conversation was over. This time we found one coping device worked really well, and it's one that I hate talking to people about. It's going to sound bad. It's called selective ignoring. What it amounts to is that after the episode is over with, to the extent you can sort of ignore the person, the episode, sort of drive it out of your consciousness, your stress levels get lower. It is almost as though you have to get beyond the interaction, and if you get beyond the interaction, you're all right. But no amount of "it's getting better" is going to help you much in those circumstances. Then we did a third study. Now this one was based on an article in Psychology that's got, I think, one of the greatest titles. I wish I could have ripped it off. This is wonderful. It was called "Bad is Stronger Than Good." Okay? Now, this person in Psychology reviewed all the literature that looked at bad events and good events, and across a number of different domains, the research indicates that bad things have a bigger impact on you than good things have. So you can send a child to an impoverished school, a bad school, and I can almost guarantee you they're going to fail and have all kinds of problems. You can take a kid and send him to an excellent school, and the improvement in their behavior will not be as, or the probability of success will not be as big as the probability of failure in the bad situation. Bad things have much stronger impacts than good things. So we went back and we hypothesized that when it comes to stress, trying to resolve your conflict through constructive means will be will have less of an impact on your stress levels than using destructive means, meaning the more destructive you are, the more you counter-complain and demand withdrawal and all that ugly stuff, the greater the likelihood of your stress. If you're constructive by trying to create alternatives and all the rest of that stuff, it'll have a much smaller impact in reducing your level of stress. Plus, because we know that arguments are sloppy, people aren't always constructive. They get a little bit ugly, and then they get a little nice, and then they get a little ugly, and it's a mixture of all this stuff. So we predicted there would be an interaction such that when there is constructive communication with destructive, destructive will wipe out the positive effects of constructive. So if there's any ugliness that occurs with the constructive, whop! Because remember, bad is stronger than good. And that's exactly what we found. Bad is stronger than good. So when you tell people, you can be a little bit ugly as long as you're constructive. Bad, bad, bad. Doesn't work that way. Be purely constructive, because if there's any badness that occurs, it starts alleviating the positive effect of the constructive. So we got that one done. Then we decided that we wanted to look at better measures of the stress reactions you get. And we started going out. I had another student who came along, Rachel Malice, and it was a nice mix because, of course, I'm interested in conflict. She was interested in health communication, and she brought in more knowledge about health measures than what I had. So we started using measures of post-traumatic stress syndrome to measure the trauma that occurs after an argument. Any of you know about good old post-traumatic stress syndrome? There are 3 elements that go along with it. One of them is a state of hyperarousal. Okay? One of the things that will happen after a stressful event is you are fired up. Right? I've been, unfortunately, in auto accidents, and the level of adrenaline flowing after that is amazing. And I've been in some ugly arguments where the level of adrenaline is flowing is amazing, and you are jittery. Then, a second aspect of post-traumatic stress syndrome is intrusive thoughts. They come into your mind, you can't stop it. Boom! There it is. A little like our mulling measure. suddenly you remember the statements that person made to you, and you start dwelling on them more and more and more. And then the third aspect of post-traumatic stress syndrome is avoidance. Because the intrusion is so bad, you try very hard to quit thinking about it or even encountering stimuli that cause you to think about it. And of course, the irony from that research is the more you try to avoid it, the more you think about it. So there's a mutually causal relationship between trying to avoid thinking about this and having intrusive thoughts. So we went back and we tried to find out if we could sort of draw better links between post-traumatic stress syndrome and your general stress symptoms, and then looking at the kinds of conflict behaviors people engaged in. Well, we went into it optimistic. That was a rare event for me, but I went into it optimistic, hoping that integrative measures would reduce your stress. They didn't. Essentially what we found in our path analyses is an indirect effect such that the more you try to avoid, the more you try to be integrative, the more you use distributive techniques, the higher the level of hyperarousal that occurs afterwards, and the higher the level of hyperarousal, the greater the stress syndrome, or stress symptoms. We even got a measure that they use for people who are under stress that measure the degree to which your mental and physical health interferes with your daily activities. So it's not just a listing of I can't sleep, it's like how much am I screwed up in what I'm doing every day as a result of this, and found the same kind of paths occurring when we were looking at it there. So it would appear that any engagement in arguing sets off hyperarousal, and hyperarousal promotes the likelihood of some sort of a health issue afterwards. Even though it's likely to be a relatively minor one, it's still going to be something that's going to make you feel uncomfortable. Well, so far I'm striking out. I can't figure out what I can find here to advise people to do. So the last study, before I use up all of my time and you can fall completely asleep, is that I was looking at a variable that's called the self-silencing scale. We talked about this last night. Some researchers put together a scale called the propensity to self-silence. It was originally started by a group of researchers who were looking at wives who felt intimidated by their husbands and couldn't speak up. Those of you who are of my generation remember All in the Family, Archie Bunker and Edith, and he'd tell Edith to stifle, and Edith would always stifle. And that was for me sort of the media image I have of self-silencing. And the way the original theory was started is they felt that wives who self-stifled had lower self-esteem as a result and were more subject to depression. And a lot of the original research verified that, but they made a tiny error. They never interviewed a man. So they suddenly interviewed men and said, do you ever self-stifle? And they all went, yes. And they found there were gender differences when you started looking at that. It turns out that self-stifling is bad for women. They have lower self-esteem and they're more depressed. And there is no correlation for men between self-stifling and depression or self-esteem. And in fact, it appears that men use self-silencing as a form of conflict avoidance. When you ask them, why do you do it? They say, well, I don't want to fight with her, so I just don't say anything. I keep my thoughts to myself. Now that implied to me it might be functional for some people, not desirable for your relationship, now remember, but could be functional in terms of your stress reduction. So we got measures of your propensity to self-silence, and we added a new variable called the need for closure. Some of you may know about the need for closure. They study it in small groups and other things, where some people, I'm guilty of it. I'm a person who unfortunately needs closure. I hate things that have no end. It just drives me nuts. And so we kind of look at things and go, enough of this. That's the reason I'm lousy at faculty meetings, because the discussion tends to go on forever with no apparent closure. And shut up! And they just keep talking. And so there are some people, and they will even sacrifice finding a quality decision to bring the damn thing to a close. So it seemed to us that in serial arguing situations, people who have a high need for closure use self-silencing as a way of reducing their stress, because to bring the topic back up means it's not closed and they have to go through it time and time again. But if you're a person with a low need for closure, you like to talk, you like to explore options, you like to explore ideas. Ta-da! This is fun, right? So for those individuals, if they self-silence, they're stressed. It's really hard for them because it violates their natural curiosity and talkativeness. So we went back through, did a test of it, and whoa, that's what we found. A nice interaction between self-silencing and need for closure. The problem was that the slope between self-silencing and stress for the people who have a high need for closure was negative but not statistically significant. But again, the interaction suggested the slopes were different from each other. So what I've been doing, as you can tell, is sort of moving along from sort of this early version that said, in my research, you can solve things, you can persuade people, you can reach integrative agreements, to, hey, maybe you can save relationships, to now saying, save yourself. Thank you. If you have any questions. Yes?
I have a question. Thanks for that presentation. I'm wondering about when you talked about the gendered dynamics, and when you talked about the self-silencing, for example, although it's sort of a thread throughout the entire thing. What happens if you do comparative studies with, say, same-sex couples or people who aren't necessarily in? It doesn't have to be a sexual relationship, but I'm just kind of thinking that it seems more to be about the positions of relative power. You would find, say, self-silencing, like, you know, say I'm sitting in a meeting with my faculty committee or something, and they say something that I don't agree with theoretically, I'm not going to speak.
That's a wise move on your part. let me endorse that. Yeah, I mean, you know, when it was originally conceived of, the concept was all about power, because it was Edith, Bunker, and Archie. I mean, that's what really was driving the model. But the problem is, when you look at the scale, it doesn't necessarily imply that there's a power difference. It's just a behavioral action you've got, meaning you're stifling yourself. And as I found out in my conflict avoidance stuff, people can stifle for a lot of different reasons. And I'd like to believe my relationship with my wife is at least semi-egalitarian. And I stifle. I don't know how often she stifles, but I stifle a lot. And so as a result, it's not entirely power-driven. It's just a coping device with what are apparent agreements, and the opportunity costs that are associated with arguing. I mean, that's the other thing. Vukanich did this great study on family quarrels, and he found that most of them are short. They don't last very long at all. They go about 3 speaking turns, and people stop. And he argues there's an attenuation factor in an argument that brings them to a rapid close after about 3 statements. His reason for that is they disrupt other activities that you, I mean, that's one of his reasons, is that they disrupt other things you could do. The purpose of coming to the supper table for the majority of people is to eat, not to argue. And arguing while you're eating often disrupts appetite. So people will self-stifle in that circumstances for reasons other than power differences. And I think you're right. Probably context plays a difference. But again, if we treat self-stifling as a behavioral response, the power difference is just one of several motivations people could have for self-stifling.
Actually, I have a related question, and that has to do with whether you're self-stifling as the initiator of the conflict versus the target.
Yeah.
Because I could see that if you feel that, you know, there's something that's driving me crazy about you and I'm not mentioning it, that seems very different than if I mention it to you and then you say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to let this escalate. I'm just going to cut it off here and self-stifle the response. Yeah.
It's interesting that Gottlieb did a study where he kind of made the distinctions you did and correlated them with divorce over a 2-year period of time. So he got a set of couples. And his initial argument going into this, he was sort of one of those individuals who believed arguing was good for relationships and instead found the more frequently you argue, the more likely you'll get divorced within a 2-year period. And his fallback position was what many people have. It depends on how you argue. And he found there were 2 types of avoidance, which I'm trying to get at your question. The first type of avoidance is the kind I was picking up in my questionnaire on conflict avoidance. There's something I find annoying about you, but I'm not initiating it because I don't tell you. The second type is minimization that occurs during the conflict itself and appears more like stonewalling. So you say something that hurts me, and I basically don't respond to it. Okay? It's a stonewall attempt. It's still conflict avoidance. When he correlated those 2 things with the probability of getting a divorce, people who withhold their complaints had a lower probability of getting divorced, but people who stonewall during the conversation had an increased probability of getting a divorce. So once the thing gets on the table, you're stuck, right? You are stuck. I mean, Denise Solomon, one of my former students who's doing the cortisol research at Penn State, she went in and I don't know how her IRB did it, let her do it, but she brought them in and let them fight it out and got measures of cortisol. And she started relaying it back to the kinds of things they did. And she found that the thing that increased your cortisol level the most was the demand withdrawal, the stonewalling effect, except she called it disqualification. So you'd look at the other person and you'd say, damn it, you need to change. Silence. Yeah. And the cortisol levels for those people just shut. No, just for that person. Wow. This person's fine. What I don't hear can't hurt me. Right? What I don't process is not a problem for me. But for the other person, it's maddening.
Oh, no, I know that, but...
I love it! This is good, this is good.
You set that trap about 20 minutes ago.
Aren't you glad I'm here? And it's documented on tape. This is good.
Oh, yeah. But there's a lot of very positive things that can take place because people are using silence to their advantage.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in Gottman's research, he talks about those avoidant couples that don't fight much at all. And he said the real danger for them is they seem to lack emotional energy. And so one of the problems you get into is if you're in an avoidant couple, if bad things occur, it doesn't bother you very much. But if good things occur, it doesn't make you very happy either. They seem to be emotionally flat people, where there no disturbance in their relationship sets them off either in a positive or negative way. Yeah.
Yeah, just sort of building off. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
It seems that there's somewhat of an assumption that the stress kind of is created by the relationship, or that, I guess what I keep thinking is, it's an allocate. There's kind of an allocation problem here. Like, I may get stressed from a lot of places, and it may be that, okay, within my relationship, I can put it onto my wife and she'll take it, but it's not really necessarily created by the relationship. And part of what, not to say you're advising this, but part of what you're sort of saying as well, because the relationship is stressful, a way to save yourself is this, but it's very close to saying, dump everything onto the other person because you'll be happier that way, which is not really true, because then once you're divorced, let's say, where are you going to dump it?
Your friends. Your family. Yeah, you can find somebody else out there.
Is that part of the problem, that people should be learning to deal with stress, not learning to sort of find other people with whom...
I think you're right. But there's an important distinction I was thinking about last night that sort of dovetails with this. Sometimes the conflict occurs because you really did something to the other person, so you stimulated the stress. Then there are other situations where something else that maybe is connected to you but you didn't do created the stress, and now they're coming to you. And in the clinical literature, they do talk about emotional flooding and transference. So if I've had a bad day at work and I come in and my wife didn't put enough gasoline in the car and I go to turn the car and it's dead, right? I come up to find her and go, I'm late to work already. Don't you know how to, you know. So then we've got multiple causes here. I'm stressed because I got to get to work. She forgot to put the gasoline in. Who deserves my stress? Okay? Now, with emotional flooding and transference, conceivably what happens is if I just go out and I've had a bad day at work, I see my wife, and I come home and say, you know what the goddamn chair of the department did, right? And so I'm pissed off, and I'm hoping she's going to accept that. She will accept being emotionally flooded.
Right.
And there is a transference of resource, at least the clinicians talk about, because I'm sending that to you.
Right.
If you refuse to accept it, I'm pissed.
Right.
Right? So if I look and I go, you know what the goddamn chair did? My wife looks at me and goes, and it's your goddamn fault.
Right.
Oh, man. Whoa. The cortisol is flowing. And I'm about to die, and she's happy with that. I mean, you know, you're sitting there just, you're really ticked off as a result of that. Or you come, goddamn chair, you know what they did? And they just sit there and they look at you. And they don't share that anger. And so almost, I've never been much of a believer in the cathartic effect. I've seen it fail in too many different domains. But the assumption they're kind of making is that when I successfully transfer that stress to you, I feel so damn much better. Right? So when I get my wife going, yeah, the chair's awful. You know, you're a great person. That person sucks. Let's go kill them. You know, I'm sort of sitting there going, yeah, let's go get them. I feel so much better now. No, let's not kill them. That wouldn't be good. But thank you for the support. You know, so you're sitting there feeling like, you know, it's gotten better. So some of it could be generated from external stress that you come in and talk to that other person about, hoping that person will accept your stress, which means theirs is going up. Right? That's your successful interaction, and if you feel any catharsis, you're feeling much better as a result of all this. There is the cost of being in a relationship.
We're going to let our last question be from another Northwesterner.
Thank you. When I was hearing serial argument, I was thinking about drama, which you could define as a kind of serial argument you settle into. And I was wondering what turns stress to pleasure, because when you watch, and because it's on a stage, but what is it that creates that threshold where you can listen to the same arguments, and if you overheard them and they were close to you by people you knew or even strangers, they'd have one setting to stress you, but you see the same talk on stage and it's pleasure.
I know your distinction. Yeah. My problem, though, is I still to this day cannot sit and get involved in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. That still just stresses me out when I watch that play.
Yeah,
you know,
you read Václav Bevan and Jackson's
analysis
of it.
I know. I sit there and I watch Who's Afraid of. I watch Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton go at each other, and I must admit I feel their pain by the end of that portrayal. And to this day, it's one I don't own on DVD. I've got a number of others that I watch. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf I can't do. So I think sometimes if you can divorce yourself out of it, you're okay. But as you're pointing out, I'm teaching these people who are couples counselors, and the study that I'm hoping to do in the next year or so is I've watched some of their tapes with highly conflictual couples. I mean, by the time these people get to therapy, they're in a bad way. And I watched one where this husband and wife yelled at each other for an hour and a half. An hour and a half in nothing but fighting. And after a while, it wasn't an interchange. It was interspersed monologues where one would just start with, and let me tell you how bad that person is. And they would go on longer than a typical speaking turn. And then the other one would say, and you know what about them? And watching that thing to this day, I know the therapist who comes in and shows it, I have to sit and look away because I can't listen to the damn thing because it's so negative. And I don't know how those therapists do it. Their cortisol levels at the end of a session with a highly conflictual couple must be over the top. And, you know, they don't have the advantage I've got as a professor watching that to say, I'm going to tune it out. You know, I know what they're going to say next. I don't need to listen to that. And I find myself writing papers and, you know, doing all kinds of things to distract myself from this interchange. They are cognitively involved in it and are trying desperately. It's a little like a bad mediation, right? You're trying desperately, and you know you can't be an effective mediator if you aren't involved in the interaction. So you are drawn into a mess that is increasing your stress levels. And I know I get a lot of my counseling students telling me about the level of illness that they feel during the course of some of these sessions where, particularly after bad ones, they pick up colds and just a whole variety of things. Now, it's not a systematic study, but it's enough anecdotally to cause me to think it's something that would be worth looking at systematically to show that the stuff, even when you're an observer of it, Denise Solomon, I'll shut up in a minute, but Denise Solomon's last time I talked to her, she says, Roloff, it really is like an engagement hypothesis. The more engaged you are in a conflict or an ugly situation, the sicker you're going to become. And that engagement means either trying to be integrative, trying to be distributive, or trying to actively avoid. We don't think about the cognitive effort of trying to avoid a conflict once it's started, and that level of engagement is the fundamental problem that creates the illness.
Our speaker next week is Fred Turner from Stanford University. He's going to be talking on the Bohemian Factory, how Burning Man served as a cultural infrastructure for new media manufacturing. Would you join me in saying thank you very much?
Thank you.